Russian President Vladimir Putin said Saturday that Moscow would consider any third-party declaration of a no-fly zone over Ukraine as participation in the armed conflict. Speaking at a meeting with female pilots on Saturday, Putin said Russia would view any move in this direction as an intervention that will pose a threat to our service members. That very second, we will view them as participants of the military conflict, and it would not matter what members they are, the Russian president said. Russian President Vladimir Putin said Saturday that Moscow would consider any third-party declaration of a no-fly zone over Ukraine as participation in the armed conflict. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has pushed NATO to impose a no-fly zone over his country, warning that all the people who die from this day forward will also die because of you, as Russian forces were battering strategic locations in Ukraine. NATO has set a no-fly zone, which would bar all unauthorized aircraft from flying over Ukraine, could provoke widespread war in Europe with nuclear-armed Russia. Russia poised to deploy up to 1,000 more mercenaries to Ukraine. Also on Saturday, Ukrainian officials blamed Russian shelling for breaching a ceasefire arranged in 2 cities to evacuate civilians. The struggle to enforce the ceasefire in Mariupol, a strategic port in the southeast, and the eastern city of Volnovakha showed the fragility of efforts to stop fighting across Ukraine, as the number of people fleeing the country reached 1.4 million just 10 days after Russian forces invaded. Putin accused Ukraine of sabotaging the evacuation and even claimed Ukraine's leadership was calling into question the future of the country's statehood, saying that if this happens, it will be entirely on their conscience. Speaking at a meeting with female pilots on Saturday, Putin said Russia would view any move in this direction as an intervention that will pose a threat to our service members. Russian President Vladimir Putin poses for a photo during his meeting with representatives of the flight crew of Russian airlines as he visits to Aeroflot Aviation School outside Moscow, Russia, Saturday, March 5, 2022. Earlier, the Russian Defense Ministry said it had agreed with Ukraine on evacuation routes out of Volnovakha and Mariupol, the site of growing misery amid an ongoing assault that created desperate scenes at hospitals and raised the prospect of food and water shortages for hundreds of thousands of people in freezing weather. In comments carried on Ukrainian television, Mariupol Mayor Vadim Boychenko said thousands of people had gathered for safe passage out of the city and buses were departing when shelling began. We value the life of every inhabitant of Mariupol, and we cannot risk it, so we stopped the evacuation, he said. Before Russia announced the ceasefire, Ukraine had urged Moscow to create humanitarian corridors to allow children, women and the older adults to flee the fighting, calling them question number 1. Ukrainians crowd under a destroyed bridge as they try to flee crossing the Irpin River in the outskirts of Kiev, Ukraine, Saturday, March 5, 2022. Ukrainian soldiers help a fleeing family crossing the Irpin River in the outskirts of Kiev, Ukraine, Saturday, March 5, 2022. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov on Saturday said Russia was ready for a third round of talks on that and other issues, but he asserted that the Ukrainian side, the most interested side here, it would seem, is constantly making up various pretexts to delay the beginning of another meeting. Diplomatic efforts continued as U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken arrived in Poland to meet with the Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, a day after attending a NATO meeting in Brussels, in which the alliance pledged to step up support for Eastern Flank members. In the wake of Western sanctions, Aeroflot, Russia's flagship state-owned airline, announced that it plans to halt all international flights, except to Belarus, starting Tuesday. While a vast Russian armored column threatening Ukraine's capital remained stalled outside Kiev, the shelling in Mariupol showed Russia's determination to cut Ukraine off from access to the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, further damaging the country's economy. Ukrainian officials blamed Russian shelling for breaching a ceasefire arranged in 2 cities to evacuate civilians. Light machine gun ambush in Kiev. Even in cities that have fallen to the Russians, there were signs of resistance, peaceful or otherwise. As homes in the northern city of Chernihiv burned from what locals blamed on the Russian shelling that's targeted Ukraine's urban areas from the start, Ukrainian officials released images showing a Russian plane they said was shot down there. Presidential advisor Alexei Arestovich said the situation was generally quiet Saturday, and Russian forces have not taken active action since the morning. Instead, it was Putin who was most on the offensive with his comments warning against a wider war. Ukraine's president has pleaded for a no-fly zone over his country and lashed out at NATO for refusing to impose one, warning that all the people who die from this day forward will also die because of you. A view from a hospital window broken by shelling in Mariupol, Ukraine, Thursday, March 3, 2022. NATO has set a no-fly zone, which would bar all unauthorized aircraft from flying over Ukraine, could provoke widespread war in Europe. But as the United States and other NATO members send weapons for Kiev, the conflict is already drawing in countries far beyond Ukraine's borders. As Russia cracks down on independent media reporting on the war, major international news outlets said they were pausing their work inside the country. Moscow also blocked Facebook and Twitter. And in a warning of a hunger crisis yet to come, the UN World Food Programme has said millions of people inside Ukraine, a major global wheat supplier, will need food aid immediately. Ukraine's president was set to brief US senators Saturday by video conference as Congress considers a request for $10 billion in emergency funding for humanitarian aid and security needs. Marina Yatsko and her boyfriend Fedor comfort each other after her 18-month-old son Kirill was by shelling in a hospital in Mariupol, Ukraine, Friday, March 4, 2022. And the UN Security Council scheduled an open meeting for Monday on the worsening humanitarian situation. The United Nations estimates that 12 million people in Ukraine and 4 million fleeing to neighboring countries in the coming months will need humanitarian aid. At least 351 civilians have been confirmed since Russia's invasion on February 24, but the true number is probably much higher, the UN Human Rights Office has said. Russia said Wednesday 498 of its troops had been and has not updated since. Kiev's central train station remained crowded with people desperate to flee. People just want to live, one woman, Ksenia, said.